Over the last 5 years, these are some of the colours that I've tested, and it's actually turned into quite a large collection, over 1,000. So I've been curious about testing these and using them in my representational works. Some examples you can see here. Each of these is an inch-sized piece of copper with a hole drilled into it, and I've tested the colour direct on copper, over flux, over fine silver, 24 karat gold, and over white enamel. So now in this video, I just wanted to do a short summary of the process. I actually like to mark the copper with the number of the piece of enamel that I'm going to be testing. That way that information doesn't get lost. So this one is Hirasawa H28A, and it's a purple. This hammer's probably a little bit light. I usually like to use a heavier hammer. So there, we've got it. And then what I do after this step is I wash the grease off the blank. One of the products that you can use to help clean up your copper is Penny Bright, the copper cleaner. And you can just pop a little, oops, it's a little bit separated. You can just use that and it quickly cleans up copper. And we just want to make sure that the water sheets off. And there we've got a clean blank. Step is that I'm actually going to paint some Scalex, which is this oxide inhibitor made by Thompson, and I'm going to put that on the side that will eventually do the colour sample itself. And what that means is that there's less cleanup after I fire the counter enamel. So what I do is just pop that on the kiln to dry, or you can accelerate the drying of it with a heat gun as well. So pop the kiln or a heat gun, or just let it dry, sort of like a mud. I'll dry oxide inhibitor, the Scalex on the back, and which will actually be the front. And what we're going to do now is apply the counter enamel. So I'm going to use a flux so that you'll still be able to read the numbers that I stamped in. And here I've got some Bridge 8100, which is quite a hard flux, but you could use anything. I often use the scrap, like the washed flux and the fines. And what I'm going to do is apply a thin mist of a 50-50 clear fire and distilled water mix, and then I'm just going to sift on a layer. This is probably a 40 mesh sifter, but then I'm going to fire that. So it's a fairly thick layer, and I'll just be doing one layer of counter enamel. All right, so we're just going to fire that counter enamel, and the kiln is at 800 degrees. So we've got that sifted layer, and we're actually going to fire this for twice the amount of time that I would normally fire to try and get the flux to clear. This flux will usually take a couple of firings to clear fully. So we'll load that in, and I'll actually set a timer for that one. All right, so we'll pull this out. So that flux has cleared as that would normally, but the main thing I wanted to show you is how copper, the Scalex just flakes off and leaves quite a clean copper surface to work on. So now that the copper started to cool, you can see that the flux hasn't entirely cleared and some of that oxide is still there. So in subsequent fires, that will clear. I've just taken the blank and cleaned it with some Penny Bright again. You could also pop it in the pickle and just give it a brush. So the colour that we're testing is this H28A, and what I've actually done, rather than just washing the 80 mesh enamel, which has all the particles, I've actually sifted it. So I've put the 80 mesh enamel through a sifter that's 200 mesh, and the 200 mesh, which goes to the bottom, I've separated out, and I use that for painterly type effects and for my painting in enamel. And then the 200 mesh is great for doing things like plique jour and cloisonne. It gives great clarity. So that way I have virtually zero wastage of enamel. Whereas if I just went straight to washing the 80 mesh, I'd have to wash it several times, so it takes longer, and those fines would be ending up in the bottom of the jar. So then they'd end up only really useful for counter enamel. So just wanted to explain that. So basically with the color sample, I'm just going to use this 200 mesh, this 80 to 200 mesh enamel. And I'm just going to a little bit in the bottom. So normally if it was 80 mesh enamel, I'd probably be washing it 6 or 7 times. Because I've already sifted it, it'll be quite clear from the outset. So that's washing it with distilled water. So it'll basically only need 1 or 2 washes, and you get a great clarity with that. So that's one of the benefits of pre-sifting your enamel, less waste. The other colours I've already prepared. So I use foundation white to test. I used to use titanium white from Thompson 1020. It was just a little bit soft under unleaded colours. 1020 is certainly great for going under leaded colours. 1030, which is foundation white, goes under everything. So it's a good all-round unleaded white that can go under all of the leadeds that I've tested and all unleadeds that I've tested. 2030 is Thompson's medium flux, and this has already been washed, but I usually just give it a little mini rinse. And I find that is my preferred flux. It clears really beautifully on copper and really reliably, and it stays clear. So that's my preferred flux. And again, I've tested it under all the unleadeds and all of the leadeds, and it plays really nicely with them. So here we have one of my early samples. So this was one of the first ones that I did. And you'll note here that this was using titanium white. So there is a little bit of bubble through the white because it's a bit soft. So this is why I went to foundation white for here, which goes a lot better under the unleaded colours. And the other thing you'll notice is that the colour direct on copper has cleared beautifully here. And this is why I lay that colour down and fire it in the flux layer hotter so that it clears. Whereas in these ones, I used to put the flux and the silver and the white down and then pickle it and apply the colour layer in the third firing. But it never looked beautiful on direct on copper. So I guess the moral of that is if you want the copper colours to clear beautifully, you need to treat them more like a flux direct on copper and clear those oxides. All right, so we've got our clean copper, and I'm just going to spray that with the 50-50 clear fire water mixture. And then we're actually going to test our colour. So the first part of my format, and everyone uses their own format, is I test the colour direct on copper. So this is direct on copper. And then next I lay down the flux, and we're laying down the flux not just in the area where the colour will be tested over the flux, but also we're laying down the flux so that we can, in the next firing, put down foils so that we can also test the colour direct on gold and direct on fine silver. And then in the final corner, this is where I test on 1030 white. I just add a little bit of more flux onto this corner. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is actually wick the water away. So I've just got some toilet paper, just a square of toilet paper, and I'm going to draw the water out just like that. And I actually don't dry my samples, so I actually go then straight to the kiln and fire. And that just holds the enamel in place, but there's no water left in it to sort of bubble out. So we've gone straight to the kiln. The kiln's actually up a bit higher now. So it's actually up at about 860. So I'm actually going to fire this for 2 minutes just because I want to give that flux a chance to clear. And also I find that when I'm doing the colour direct on copper, I get the best result if I also fire that colour initially quite high. And that's why I do the colour direct on copper in the same layer as the flux. So you see that the purple has cleared on the copper and there's no red left in the flux. And the white, being a little bit softer, has spread a little bit. But I allow for that when I'm placing the white down. So at this point, we're going to apply some foils, and we just want to clean up the oxides around the edges so that doesn't flake onto the sample. So I'm just going to use diamond pad to just clean up that edge. I've got some straight Clearfire here, and I'm just going to apply a single drop there to glue the foil on. And I've got some foils here this is 24 karat gold foil. It is actually foil, so it's a little bit thicker. And this is fine silver foil. Again, not leaf, so it is foil. And what I want to do is apply that glue where I want my foils to go, and get some tweezers and apply the foil where I want it to go. The gold foil is a little harder to handle and can only be handled on the paper. So it's a little more delicate. There we go. So I might just chop off that little bit extra. And that is ready. I usually just sit that on the top of the kiln for a few minutes and that will be ready to fire. So this will be a much shorter firing just to adhere those foils. So I'm just going to pop that in. It's at 860 still, and we're just going to fire that for 1 minute. So we're going to pull that out, and you can see that the foil has adhered to the surface. If it needs to be pressed down anywhere, you can do that, but that one as well adhered. Whoops. And of course, normally you wouldn't need to, you can leave it on the trivet to cool. Just for expediency, I'm cooling it on a steel block, and that's well adhered. So we're ready for the next layer of colour. So with some colours, purples, reds, pinks, yellows, oranges, there can be reactivity to silver. And if you're uncertain about this, a good way to test that is at this stage. So you would actually apply flux over the silver. This is Sawyer number 3 flux, which is a good headed flux over silver. And what I do is I leave a small section exposed that doesn't have flux on it, which will show if the colour is reactive when we apply the colour. So this is an extra firing, but which colours are silver reactive is widely available information. So you might not necessarily have to test for that. But if you do want to, this is a good step. So we're just going to fire that flux layer on to test for silver sensitivity. So this is what all the hard work is for. So we're going to apply the first layer. We want it to be not too thick a layer, like a nice even layer. What I'm trying to achieve is sort of 1 grain thickness evenly over the whole surface. But I definitely want it to be covered. And we don't at this stage put extra colour over top of where it is tested directly on copper. So at this stage we're only putting this layer over where, so remember this was where the flux was, this is where the silver, this is the 24 karat gold, and this is over the white. And we can give it a little in the colour, and you can usually see if the layer's even. All right, and then we're going to wick the water away like we did before, and if there's any cleanup needed, so I'm just going to take that extra colour off there, brush, and that is ready to fire. All right, so we're going in for the first layer of colour, and I know from experience that about a minute for this colour, but again we just want to fire it until it's glossy. Bearing in mind that I'm firing it quite high, most of my samples I fired at 800 degrees Celsius, and they would be fired for about a minute and a half. You can see that as the colour cools, it begins to change. That's typical of most enamel colours. So you'll notice that there is a slight different colour here where I left the corner exposed, and that's because this colour is reactive to silver. So that is a good indicator that you would use a flux layer. And what I find is, whilst that's quite subtle now, the more times that it's fired, the more pronounced the reaction becomes. So we're going to actually add a second layer And that's because I like to see what the buildup of colour looks like with multiple layers, not just one layer, because the reality of working with enamel is that you would do more than one layer. And how I do that is I just put a row down the center like this, and then we'll get to see. So we're just going to wick the water away and just clean up the line, so there is a sort of marked line. When we're looking at the sample, you can tell where it's one layer and where it's two layers. And I could tell that that was still a little bit wet, so I just tapped it again to bring that water to the surface, and then that just makes sure that it's ready to fire. So this is our final firing of our second layer of colour, and about the same amount of time. From experience, that would start to go to sugar fire at about 40 seconds, 40 to 45 seconds. So you do, as you work with colours, you do get a sense of how hard or soft they are. And being a little bit probably longer than it needs, it should be fired nice and glossy. Because we've got extra layers, we've only got one layer of counter enamel. By the time you're getting to this thickness, it's more important to let it cool slowly rather than do things like put extra stress on it, put a hot piece on a cold piece of steel. So it's more imperative that you let it cool a bit slower. Otherwise, you're more likely to get cracking. You will notice that the reaction is a little bit more obvious now, and it could have been fired a tiny bit longer. There's still evidence of orange peel, but that's how I do my colour samples.